welcome back to episode 2 of ABMA Tuesdays. It's me, your host, Matthew Mercado, and once again, I'm joined by our other hosts, Trisha Alcantara and Mika Jacinto. Although for today's episode, and hopefully for the rest of the series, we are joined by a fourth member. So, Iko, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, I would. So my name is Iko. I did the solo podcast, which I would never do again. Sort of regret, but it was a fun learning experience. Also, uh, forgive the saturation. I have a lamp here, so it provides my enlightenment in this dark room.
Okay, so all right. So Iko will be joining us. Hopefully for the rest of the series, if we aren't too much of a burden on him. Uh, last week we talked about our interests and hobbies during the pandemic. So as the newest member, I would have to ask you, how was your quarantine experience so far?
Oh well, being stuck in the same living space for a long time can take a bit of a toll on your mental health. But I've been experiencing modernity by making my own online bank account. Just I really needed one. Yeah.
Okay, all right, so nice. So at least there's a silver lining to that. If you guys want to talk more about like hobbies and interests and the stuff we did over quarantine and all that discussions like that, you could go on over to our previous podcast where we talked more in depth about that. Although for today's session, if you remember from last week, we sort of hinted what the topic was going to be. We were going to talk about what life would be like without modernity or without some aspects of modernity. So it's a pretty interesting. I just think it's a pretty interesting conversation, right? All of us were sort of born. All of us were born in a modern world. Um, we don't really know for sure what life was like without modernity, without a lot of things like globalization and whatnot. We can only really like imagine briefly. So yeah, life without modernization, life without modernity, like be it your personal life or society or just in general. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think modernity is a pretty wide topic to discuss, but I think an aspect of it fitting for the Philippine context is secularism.
Okay, all right. So before we proceed, I want you, so since you brought up the topic of secularism, could you define that for us?
Yeah, as defined by Hamilton, secularism is an ethic most commonly seen in the form of anti-clericalism. It's like an opposition to church authority and traditional Catholic, religious thinking. So I guess in layman's term, or a term most familiar with as Paul Sci students, it's basically the separation of church and state.
Right. Okay. And so you did. So you mentioned Catholic, and you mentioned the Philippines. So I actually like really agree. Right. Secularism is a pretty interesting topic to discuss with our context. So I guess for a lot of the foreign viewers out there, the Philippines is a very Catholic, it's a very religious country. It's mainly Catholic, I believe. Um, and so a lot of the things that when we discuss secularism, like in a broader world perspective, the Philippines isn't really what you'd think about when you think about secularism because religion is so intertwined with a lot of things. And I think that's a pretty good enough starting point. So when we talk about secularism, when we talk about um, countries like the Philippines, when we imagine a world without secularism, so without like the separation of church and state, it's a pretty good starting point to discuss the Philippines. So any thoughts?
Oh, well, jumping off your point on the Philippine context, we need to realize that Philippines is not exactly a Western, perfectly modern country. We're in that sort of weird limbo between modernity and the old tradition. So we're like not fully modern, but because we have some parts of traditional religious authority still a part of our culture. And when we want to hypothesize a world without, Philippines without secularization, without modernity, it'll be actually just easy to intensify or exacerbate the traditional religious aspect of our culture. So also jumping off that, I feel like the first aspect of secularization we can look at is actually ourselves, how we think. Because, well, here's a quote: how Hamilton saw the Enlightenment. He saw it as a way of um, the ideas of the Enlightenment of thinking about society in a different way. So, I mean, short definition of secularization, as said by Mika, in terms of thinking for ourselves, it has a focus on secular knowledge, on rationality, compared to the old dogmatic doctrines of traditional society. Um, so if we want to take out our secular way of thinking, our scientific way of thinking, take out logic, take out the reason, take all of those out, and we just have a dogmatic, traditional way of thinking. So it's more of adherence to established cultural norms, religious authority in our lives, and we don't really get to think of ourselves, in a sense. In a sense, we actually get more collectivist in that sense. And personally, I would not question assumptions more. There's not much room for questioning. We have to conform more to the commonly held beliefs. And as said by Nika, there's no emphasis on secular knowledge. And we're just going to focus on keeping the status quo of assumptions that we always have. And our traditional cultural norms will always be what has always been, in a sense. So whenever stuff happens to us, phenomena, disasters, Typhoon Undoy, instead of explaining it as a scientific way, in a scientific way that it's because of nature, we would explain it as because of the divine will of God, or actually because of Filipino folk beliefs. And jumping off that again, a big aspect of how our way of thinking is affected is through the family. And Trisha, I think she can share much of that.
Definitely, I want to really go off of what Ika said, especially his points on, the way that uh, religious thinking has kind of affected who we are as individuals, and how that has kind of led us into, feeling that we need to conform to structures that already exist, and how all of this is kind of exacerbated by the role that our family plays. I don't know about the rest of you, but personally, I am a Christian, a Protestant Christian, who studied in a Catholic school for um, virtually almost all of my life. And I kind of noticed that when I was in Catholic school, there was a really big emphasis on conformity, and not a lot of emphasis on critical thinking or individualism. It was kind of like, this is how you have to be, not because it's what's right, but because that's just how it is. I went to a really small private Catholic school in Antipolo, and it I remember that when it came to issues such as sexuality or gender expression, when the school's administration found out that there was a student of that school who was uh, homosexual or had attraction to the same sex, their first instinct was to bring them into counseling and convince them that what they were thinking was incorrect. And that definitely like bled into other that definitely like affected the way that we thought as individuals. Our first instinct became that this type of being different or was incorrect. It was unnatural and it was wrong. uh, I definitely see what eco means by that.
Yeah. I think I have a similar experience with religion and my family, because personally, I'm a non-believer. I'm agnostic, and a few years back, I told my parents that I'm agnostic, and to my surprise, they didn't really have any violent reactions. Uh, I think it's due in part that because we never really go to mass, we're not really practicing Christians. We're not religious in any sense, I guess. But what surprised me the most is when held to their views on homosexuality and the like, they have pretty negative views on it. And I guess when it comes to secularism, its aim is not to eliminate religion itself, but rather the dogma that's closely attached to the ideas of religion and its effects on cultural conventions and social norms.
I mean, yeah, I do have a very similar experience, especially when we're talking about like families, right? Although like for me, it was more of when I told my family I was agnostic, since I was agnostic for a while. Um, when I told them I was agnostic, they just pretended that I didn't say anything. So that's yeah. I mean, Philippines, uh, we're not the most secular society in the world, obviously. Although at this point, I think it's important to make it clear that a secular society is very different from an atheist society, right? Whereas atheism is more associated with we believe that there is no God or there is no like function of religion. A secular society is sort of implies more of they exist on two different spectrums and we shouldn't really meddle in each other, right? And I think so. A bit of a tangent, but the in our political science class we would learn about Saint Augustine of Hippo, who wrote the City of God, and one of the foundations of his work was to say there is an earthly kingdom and there's also a heavenly kingdom, and you should both appeal to both of these authorities at the same time, because he recognized that both of these were very important for people. Yeah, so essentially he was the one who coined the separation of church and state.
The notion of the separation of church and state, I feel like it's very fitting as well that we talk about an aspect of secularism that I think is of significant influence to society today, which is the aspect of governance. Widely discussed in our previous module is the divine rights of kings, which entails the idea that holds religion to an absolute pedestal in choosing the next leader of people in society. So this is negated by many social contract thinkers, among Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau specifically formulated that kings are there to serve the people and not the other way around. So without secularism, I feel like it would be harmful for the idea of the social contract, as well as the legitimacy of governance. This, in turn, I think, consequentially disrupts and hampers democracy and society as well.
Right. Once again, to point out, the Philippines is not necessarily a pre-secular or pre-modern world, but for what it's worth, with the level of like intimacy that religion has with politics, we do have a lot of these problems, right? We have problems with politicians using a specific line of religious dogma for their policies and for justifying their policies. Not going to name who. You have religious institutions, for an example, who are forcing their followers to vote for politicians, which, if the first example was just subtle, the second one is like pretty glaringly obvious that it's kind of a danger to a lot of like democratic values, which I guess is the magnum opus of us political science majors. So yeah, like sort of in summary so far, we have this concept of secularization and how the absence of it would affect the way we think, the way our family functions, the way society functions, and the way we conduct discussions, and the way that we go about politics and governance. So the final question I sort of have for all of you then is secularization a good thing or is it a bad thing? What are your thoughts?
I'll start. Well, personally, secularization has its benefits. It sort of criticizes everything, so they get rid of all prejudices that really have no other rational basis other than just keeping them just because they're old, and we've always done that. And ironically, since we in our specific context, these traditions like misogyny, uh, other beliefs, career biases actually. And also, and imagine just your parents, their views on your taboo beliefs or taboo topics. they would actually just be worsened. So it's not that something new would come in. It's just what we've always had to be worsened. And just extra insight, there's a quote here. Hamilton's assertion was that enlightenment affected all aspects of traditional society. But in our specific context, um, Hamilton's assertion only really applies to Western societies. So in our society, um, we just have to be aware of that specific one.
I fully agree with Iko in saying that like secularism, or I mean religious belief, does pose some dangers when it comes to, how we view thinking that could be a little bit more different, a little bit more like quote unquote taboo. One thing I want to like jump off of was the idea of like plurality in religious thinking. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was Voltaire who kind of vouched for religious tolerance, mainly because of religious plurality. Uh, Several of us in this podcast right now, we aren't Catholics, but we live in a Catholic dominated country. We study in a Catholic school, and we have felt on either very like small accounts or on very like significant accounts the feeling of isolation because our religious belief didn't line up with the Catholic beliefs that the majority possess. And I do agree with secularism, primarily because I understand that to have politics and society be based around one religious belief can be isolating for a pretty significant part of the population, particularly uh, non-practicing believers, Islam people, or atheists and agnostic people. Uh, Politics is all about representation. So why would you have politics be based around a religion that not everyone practices?
Personally, I think secularism is a good thing for society. If any, after this talk, I realized that we as people need to realize as well the privileges afforded to us by secularism as a gift of modernity. Because we need to understand that we can use this as a platform for the betterment of society in a sense that we don't shy away from liberal ideas and progressive notions of development. So I guess this can translate pretty well moving forward into the future in the Philippine context of governance.
I definitely agree. If it's for inclusion, if it's for progressivity, I'm all for that. I definitely think this is something we can talk about for like hours and days upon end. But unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for today's episode. So thank you everyone for watching.
Yeah, I hope you guys catch us next Tuesday, for the next episode of ABMA Tuesdays.
We have a midterms next week, so good luck, guys.
Hopefully Iko stays with us for the next episode. Please don't quit, Iko. Please don't leave us.
Bye.
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 Bye.